Gonna go?
Okay, you're gonna do
Oh,
that.
yes, I
Okay, so we're talking about Oakwood Cemetery, which is right next door to us. Anna's put some facts up on the slide. The first section of the cemetery was on Baird Road. It was 1 acre. The oldest marked grave is John Stroger, which is 1812, and I'll be talking about John Stroger a little bit later. There's more than 16,000 graves in the cemetery now, and that figure is old. I got that from the caretaker several years ago, and I haven't gotten an update since then, so I'm sure it's probably well above 16,000, which is amazing to me because there are multiple burials for one headstone, so there aren't 16,000 headstones, but it's a lot of graves. In 2007 to 2008, they added a mausoleum, which includes a chapel area. There are at least 9 Revolutionary War soldiers buried there, more than 50 Civil War soldiers, and then soldiers from the other wars in between. And the cemetery was named for a stand of oak trees, which no longer exist. So we will move on
Yeah.
to the first.
The photo here is the oldest bit of the cemetery. If you know it well enough, that's right up on the corner. So we're starting with what is just a fantastic story. Jacob Eckler was born in 1773. He grew up in the Mohawk Valley, east of here in New York. His father had a farm there, and it was during the American Revolution, this part of New York saw an awful lot of fighting between the Mohawks, who were on the side of the British, and the Americans who were living there. And Jacob, in August, which year was it?
1780.
Thank you. In 1780, Jacob there was a raid on his family's farm by the Mohawks, and Jacob and several of his family members were taken by the Indians. 2 of his sisters were killed by those Indians, but they kept Jacob, the Indians, as a captive, and they moved him to a Mohawk village near Fort Stanwix, which is present-day Rome in New York. From there, he was moved again to another Seneca village near Geneva, and then finally to another Seneca village near Buffalo. And he spent 7 years with the Indians as a captive, basically for the remainder of the war. From the ages, he was 7 when he was taken. After the Revolution, his father went to Buffalo and was able to bring him back home again. By then, he was 14. So that's, in your childhood, that's a fairly important part. And so anyway, he goes back with his family back to the Mohawk Valley. But his time with the Native Americans changed him in some ways. He didn't like to be inside anymore very much. He liked to be outside. He ran away several times from his family to get to go. But then his family, several members of his family, moved west into Monroe County. And he lived for a while in Mendon, where he met his wife, Christina Fethley. He married her. They moved to Pittsford for a while. Then they went back to Herkimer, back to the original area he was from. Then they came back again to Monroe County. And by 1850, he was living in Penfield, which is where he lived out the rest of his days. They had 9 children, Jacob and Christina. And this is something that you guys are going to get to see, which people on the tour didn't get to see. We're basically giving you the same tour we gave last time, but this time we have photographs. So this is the Henry Paddock House, which you can see is on Northrop Road. Henry Paddock built it in the 18-teens in Penfield. It's one of Penfield's oldest houses. And the family will tell you that it's the oldest brick house in Penfield. They used clay or materials from around there to make the bricks themselves. But when Henry Paddock died, Benjamin Eckler, who was Jacob's son, bought the house from them. And once Jacob got older, he moved in with his son. So this is the house that he lived in for his last few last few years in Penfield, and this is the house that he died in. And I just want to mention that we know this story. We haven't actually known it for very long, but we know it because of Tom here, Tom Kanauer, who is one of our committee members for the local history room, and Jacob Eckler is one of his ancestors. Wow. And so he's the one who did the research.
I just want to mention too that
Yes.
Benjamin had a son. Jacob was the grandfather, Benjamin the son, and John, they're all buried in Oakwood. John was the son of Benjamin. And John was the first supervisor of the Oakwood Cemetery in 1899 when it was incorporated. He was Benjamin's son. He was connected to the and that fact is noted in the Penfield history book.
Nice.
How are you related? Like cousins or how many generations?
He was an uncle.
Henry Eckler, the original Henry Eckler, who lived in the Mohawk Valley with his family, was a Palatine German who came to the Mohawk Valley before the Revolution, 1739. He had a son, Henry, and Henry became a captain in the militia, the Tryon County Militia, which was the American Army during the Revolution. And when Henry, my fifth great grandfather, when he was in the militia, that's when Jacob was captured by the Mohawk Indians, and he lived with them for 7 years. Jacob was the son of Henry, and so he's a fourth grade uncle of mine.
So thank you for sharing the story. Yes, he's got the dates. I would just say one thing. We're going to, as I said, this is based off the tour that we did back in the fall. This would make sense if we were walking. We've left everything in the same order. It would make sense if you were walking through the cemetery. So we're going to be skipping around a bit in time, but we figured it was one way to do it, so we were just going to keep doing it that way. All right?
So this was the original gravesite of one of my favorite characters in Penfield history, although as you can see there's no headstone marking anything there. This was the grave, the original grave of Little Nellie. Ellen Teresa Williams was born in November of 1849, and her father had several different occupations throughout time, and he also liked to play cards. And in a card game, he won a printing press. And this printing press was set up in one of the buildings. And when Nellie was 12 years old, she started fussing around with the print and decided to print out a newspaper. It was intended for the residents. She would always call it her village, which would have been around the Four Corners. But it was so novel. This little girl was putting out a newspaper at the age of 12 that word spread across the country. And it wasn't long till she had over 2,000 subscribers. And actually, the money that she made from doing that was a big help in supporting the family, because in his later years, her father was in a wheelchair. She published it during the Civil War years, and stopped publication in 1866 because the cost of the paper got too high. So, like I said originally, and actually there are still members of the Williams family that are buried at that site without a headstone. So my previous two historians and local history room coordinators, for 50 years, we looked for where Little Nellie was buried because the records that we had of Oakwood didn't show that she was there. We looked all over. She ended up marrying with a man named Henry Braden, and we even looked where he was from to see, that was Salamanca, to see if she if they ended up being buried down there, and we couldn't find her. And a few years ago, another one of our History Room committee members, Jan Brayman, suggested we start looking in the city because they'd lived in Rochester for a while. And then she also suggested we check the burial permits that are online now. And lo and behold, now it said Nellie Williams reinterred to Bergen. What happened was Nellie died of consumption in May 20th, 1875, and also her young son Frederick died from the same disease. Well, her daughter had grown up to be an adult and was living in Bergen along with Henry, Nellie's husband, who didn't die until 1909. And so the daughter had Nellie and her brother dug up and reinterred and buried with her father. And so what we're looking at here is actually little Nellie with her printer's smock, her grave with a headstone at Mount Rest Cemetery in Bergen. And then this building, which until recently was still standing, was where her printing press was found. That was where Mark's Pizzeria was on 5 Mile Line Road until they took it down a couple of years ago. And one other thing about Nellie, she did all of the work for publishing the newspaper except the actual press work. She wasn't big enough. She had to hire a man to help with the press work. So,
Do you know who's in the photographs on the right?
I'm sorry, what?
Do you know who's in the photographs on the right?
Selling fresh meat? I do not know. Do you know?
We have a thought, but
Who do you?
I don't.
Throw it out there.
Well, you said it's the Hartung.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It is the hot, yeah.
It's the Hartung,
Mhm.
which is my mom's side.
Yeah.
So, but we're not sure which generation. That's why we were curious.
And it's interesting when you have family members in a photograph. They all kind of look alike. You don't think they look alike until you're trying to identify them, and then they all look alike. So, but it's probably a family member.
That's what we were thinking.
Yeah.
So we would say label your photos, please.
That's right, for
For the
sure.
historians of the future, please label your photos.
Label with names and dates.
Yes.
That's one soapbox we get on.
Yes, we do. We do.
Okay.
All right. Are you done with Nellie?
I am done with Nellie.
Okay. All right. So now we're moving on to Artemis and Anna Fuller. Now, I've only been in the job a few months, but I've lived in Penfield since 2010, and we live down Whalen Road off of Jackson Extension. So I've always walked through the cemetery. And this grave in particular, before I had this position, always was one that I would think about a lot as I was walking through, because I don't know how well you're going to be able to see. But this is, as I said, the gravestone of Artemis and Anna Fuller, and their children. And if you look at those names and those dates, Winfield was born in 1853. He died in 1855. Mary was born in 1858. She died in 1862. Clarence was born in 1860. He also died in 1862, just a few days after Mary had died. So we don't know why. I went back into the records to just see if there was anything particular that was, affecting children. In those years, I'm assuming Mary and Clarence had something. It could have been scarlet fever, could have been measles, could have been, there's all sorts of things it could have been. But they had 4 children. 3 of them, sadly, didn't pass the age of 5. Now, Artemis was a blacksmith. He lived out at Lovett's Corners, which you guys may know. It's east of here on Penfield Road, where Harris Road and Huber Road intersect with Penfield Road. That was called Lovett's Corners. And he was a blacksmith out there. He was also very involved in the Baptist church. He was, I believe, they had a school out there, and he was a superintendent for that school. But they did have one daughter. Lorilla was actually their oldest child. She was born a few years before Winfield, and she did survive into adulthood. And I went back and I looked at the censuses for this. And in 1880, they're in the census. And Artemis and Anna are there. And they also have a child named Edward Hull, who was 11. And he was listed as an adopted son. And if you think the practicalities of being a blacksmith and you have no sons, in many ways, this was a win-win for this poor this child who needed parents and parents who needed a son. So they took him in. And also, in that census, Lorilla was living with them with her husband. And we have photographs of the family here. Artemis and Anna here. Now, to me, I look at these photos and think, gosh, they look like people who've lost 3 children. But somebody also explained to me that when you're taking photographs at that time, you're having to sit very, very still for quite a long time. So that was the way they could do it. Lorilla here married Dio Warden. The Wardens were another Penfield family. They also were living in Lovett's Corners at the time. And Dio is interesting because we also have in the history room, he was an inventor, and he has a patent for a steam turbine, which he put into a boat that he ran on the Erie Canal. And that went up and down. It did trips to Rochester from Fairport. He would take people as far as Buffalo. He took people on hunting trips. He would go east from there on the canal, then they would go into the lakes. And he took people hunting. We've also got in the history room letters from Lorilla to her daughter Eva, who only lived, 4 or 5 miles south of here. But she was a young mom, and the letters are from Lorilla basically telling her how to raise her child. And I do wonder from that how Eva felt about it. Most of those letters say, Eva, you said you were coming to see me and you haven't. Or I really want to know how my grandchildren are doing and you're not telling me. So they're fun. I mean, they're 100 years old, but several of the themes are still ones that I think that we can relate to today. So if you want to see them, they're in the local history room. This comes out of a family photo album. Some of the people are labeled, but not everybody is labeled in this. This is why we say, please do that. So that's them. And right next door to them is another gravestone. Alva and Jane. I say Covey. Kathy says Covey. But, we'll say. So they also had several children who died very, very young. But they had 5 children survived to adulthood as well. And Alva and Jane Covey lived on 5 Mile Line Road, right near Four Corners. He was a nurseryman, like many, many Penfield men at the time. He had land on both sides of 5 Mile Line Road, right about where Charles Finney School is today. He had land there on both sides. He was also big in the Baptist church. If you go into the Baptist church today, there's a stained glass window that was there to remember him. If you go back into their records as well, he built the wall in front of there's a wall in front of the Baptist church, and he built that one as well. Now, they are a family with a lot of ties to Penfield. Oakwood has really good records for who is buried. If you ever wonder if somebody is in Oakwood, there's a website you can go to. So I went in there, and of those 5 children, 4 of them are buried in Oakwood, along with many, many, many grandchildren. And at that point, I stopped counting because there were so many of them in there. Their oldest son, Eugene, took over his dad's business and also took over his house. And this is their house. Do you recognize it, those of you? Right? It's apartments now. It's older. And if you look, so Alva and Jane are the 2 people standing on the porch with a small child in between them. We don't know who the child is. But the lady sitting there is Jane's either sister or aunt. She's Aunt Hetty. So she's there.
Do you have a date for that picture?
For that picture? No, we don't.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. So one of their sons, Frank, is the one on the far right. And then in front of the kitchen, which also has a porch, is their youngest daughter, Ella. And Ella is another one who was adopted. She was not one of the children that Jane had, but she is listed in a census as being in the Protestant orphan asylum in the city. And then they adopted her. Now, we know quite a bit about them because Eugene talked to his daughters a lot about his life. And this is a house, we often get asked whether or not there's Underground Railroad sites in Penfield. And this is one of them that potentially is an Underground Railroad site. Alva was, again, a Baptist. He was an abolitionist. According to his son, he was friends with Frederick Douglass. And his son, Eugene, says that he can remember as a child being in his room and seeing slaves being sneaked out of the house and away, where they would then move on to safety. So we have nothing written down other than his recollections to his children and then to his grandchildren as well. But yeah, the other good thing about this house is there was a woman named Mary Gossel. Is that how you pronounce it? Gossel? She was a maid, anyway. She was a maid in the house, probably for the Covey family. And when she got married, she said to her husband, or her about-to-be husband, or her husband said to her, "What would you like as a wedding present? I want to give you whatever it is you really want in the world." And she said, "I want this house. I want the house of my dreams," is what she actually said. It took him 25 years, but once he retired, he was able to buy this house for her. So having been a maid in the house, she then got to be the lady of the house. And her granddaughter lived in that house until, gosh, the early 2000s, I think. Is that? Yeah.
What year was the house built?
We don't know. 1840s, I think.
I think too, but I don't
Or
know.
a bit later than that. 1840, 1850s.
Yeah, it looks like mid-1800s.
Yeah. Yeah. So
that's when it was sold to apartments after the granddaughter died?
yes, yeah. Well, it was sold to a couple of developers who restored it, and they did a lot of work on it to sort of like keep the historical integrity of it, and then they turned it into apartments.
It's pretty neat. I've been in that house when they were restoring it. From the cupola, you can see all over the four corners. It's really neat.
The final thing I'll say about this house too, I found this because I was looking in newspapers for it. It was for a little while, not an asylum is the wrong word. It was there for people who had addiction to opioids, and there was some crazy medication that was popular this is right around 1900, and the doctor.
So it was a detox center.
There was a detox center, yes. Dr. Humphrey, who, the Humphrey House restaurant, he was in there just for a little while, and the newspaper gave it a really good write-up and said it was great that Monroe County had the potential for one of these detox centers. But I don't think it can have been that successful because the house went after that. All right, that's the Cubbies.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about Henry Fellows, and I want to preempt it with saying he is a brother of Mary Fellows Penfield, Daniel Penfield's wife. So Henry was born June 26, 1782. He was the 8th child of General John Fellows and his wife, Mary Ashley Fellows, and he was born in Sheffield, Massachusetts. He was 20 years younger than Mary Penfield, so that was quite a span for those children. He graduated from Williams College in 1803 and studied law in the office of Peter Van Schack in Kinderhook, New York. In 1806, he moved to Canandaigua and established a law practice there. He married Sophia Sanborn in 1809, and then his namesake, Henry Penfield, came to be a partner in his law office in Canandaigua, and they were responsible for signing and executing a lot of the property deeds in this area because Canandaigua was the seat where everything was taking place. In 1813, Henry moved his family to Penfield, where he purchased 200 acres. The land was east of 5 Mile and north of Penfield Road. The house he built at 1880 Penfield Road was completed in 1816, and that house is still standing today. It's one of our town landmarks. When they moved to Penfield, the family consisted of 4 children. 6 more were born to them in here, and unlike some of the families that Anna's been talking about, all 10 children lived to adulthood. Henry's primary work at that time was operating his 200-acre farm, but he also still practiced some law. He served as a school commissioner. He was the town supervisor 1817 to 1828, and he also served as a justice of the peace. So he was a busy man. Henry played the fiddle for parties and dances in an upper story of their house. They had a ballroom, and they would say because they had 5 girls and 5 boys, they could complete a dance floor without anybody else coming to join them. Henry Fellows died August 5th, 1858, and it's hard to tell from this picture, but his grave, and I'm not sure why it's that way, but you can kind of see, when you go to Oakwood Cemetery, there are lanes. Some of them you can drive on, others are grassy, but you can tell they're a lane. This Fellows family plot is like cutting off one of the lanes. I'm not quite sure why it was ever sold that way, but it looked like it should go straight through, but you'd run over that grave if you tried driving there. So, for whatever reason, maybe he wanted...
land, right?
Yes, and it's a very big plot, so maybe there wasn't any other one available at the time where they were selling, I don't know. But that's the story of Henry.
Is that house supposed to be the 1880 house?
I'm sorry, what?
Is that house the one at 1880?
It is. It sets back.
Not
Doesn't
1880.
look like the
That's
same
because
house.
this is the side, and this house was extensively remodeled about 1895. I'm not sure the date of this picture. I just kind of liked it from this angle.
So we're not looking from Penfield Park?
Penfield, this would be the front of it over here.
Okay.
I think they probably took it from this side because there's a tree right in the front at that point in time. But it was quite a beautiful house, and it's still quite a beautiful house. Yep, that's it.
So this is Abel and Joseph Case, a pair of brothers, both of whom were killed in the Civil War. There's a fair number of Civil War veterans and buried in Oakwood. This one is interesting to me because Abel Case, he was 45 when he enlisted into the Army, and he left behind his wife and 3 children. So when you think of, young boys being the ones who enlisted or being called up, it's not always them. The 1850 census has him in as a wagon maker. But 1855, he's another one of Penfield's nurserymen. He worked at the Gifford and Case Nursery, which is quite a big one here in Penfield. It would have been north of 441 and east of Four Corners. That's where their one is. But at the age of 45, he left his wife, he left his children, he joined the Union Army, and he died in 1864. Now, we know a bit more about him from Little Nellie's paper, because she wrote in there, and I'm just going to read from it so I get this right. She says, "We learned from a reliable source that 2 abolitionists were shot in cold blood after being taken prisoner for uttering their sentiments. One of them, Mr. Case, told the rebels that this war was just what he'd been praying for the last 20 years. So that is the older brother, Abel Case. Joseph Case, or Joseph Byron Case, or Byron Joseph Case, we're not sure. He was killed in September 1862 at the age of 20 He died of his wounds at the Battle of Fair Oaks. And that's all we know about him. I have tried really, really hard to find out more about him. We don't really even know which regiment he was in, which is unusual for here because we've got a pretty good idea. And somebody said to me, you know, why bother talking about somebody you don't know anything about? And I would say, well, that's what history is, right? We know so much about the older one. He had a wife, he had children, he was written about in the paper. But this 20-year-old boy we know nothing about, and there's a great line in Hamilton about who lives, who dies, who tells your story. And we really are dependent on people caring enough to look back into the past. And if nobody worries about you, we really don't know. So I'm going to find out more about him somehow.
I just wanted to say, too, I started researching the Civil War soldiers around 2000. And I thought, there'll be a lot of good records there because they were in the military. And I found out the military records are some of the worst records, but there's a good excuse. They would say, somebody would be wounded, sent to the hospital, and then the next day when they took attendance, they would be listed as having deserted because they weren't there for attendance. But if you're trying to take attendance and there is gunshots going or cannon fire going on around you, you're probably not as accurate as you might be if you're standing in front of a classroom. So we might never find out more about him. But
we might not. We're going to try.
Yeah.
I'm going to try.
I think you're
next. Am I next? Oh, yeah, here we go. All right, Timothy and Lydia Bush. This is another one where it was only relatively recently that people got the significance of this grave. And I think some of that was thanks to Jan Brayman again, so thank you, Jan. So Timothy was born April the 1st, 1766. His father fought in the 7 Years' War and in the Revolution. Timothy came to Penfield probably in about 1833. He's definitely there in the 1840 census. And he was a blacksmith. And he married Lydia Newcomb, but Lydia died in 1835. Now, if you see the gravestone that we have, it says Lydia Bush. Doesn't say anything about Timothy. Timothy, in his will, left money for his daughter to purchase him a headstone for not more than $25. It's right there in the will. There is no headstone. So that daughter Lydia. But the thing about these guys, and some of you probably know this, they had a son, Obadiah Newcomb Bush, who married Harriet Smith, and Obadiah was a merchant and lived in the city of Rochester. They got married in 1821. They had a son, James Smith Bush. He was an Episcopalian minister. His wife Harriet was his second wife, and they moved around a bit, but he died in Ithaca. They had a son, Samuel Prescott Bush. You can see where this is going, right? And he married Flora Sheldon. Samuel Prescott Bush was a steel manufacturer. That was his main source of his wealth. They had a son, Prescott Sheldon Bush, who married Dorothy Walker. Prescott Sheldon Bush was a senator for the state of Connecticut. And before we get to the next one, the naming patterns are really interesting here to me, in that they are naming their sons often to honor the mother's side of the family. And finally, their son, not quite finally, Prescott Sheldon Bush and Dorothy Walker, the parents of George H.W. Bush, which makes Timothy and Lydia Bush, woohoo, the great-great-great-great-grandparents, great-great-great-great-grandparents of President George W. Bush, and obviously President H.W. Bush as well. So there's a woman who's a genealogist, and she's done a lot of the work to find all of this out. But once we discovered the grave in Penfield, the then member of Congress wrote to, at the time, President George H.W. Bush and said, here's the genealogy, can you confirm it, please? And he wrote back a hand-signed letter that said, "Looks good to me, but it's always great to know that I have another place to call home." And we've got that letter in the history room too. So if you ever want to see a presidential letter, we have that in the room. Anything you want to add to that?
He didn't give his great-great-great-grandfather a headstone. Timothy still doesn't have a
No,
headstone.
he doesn't. But Lydia does. All right.
Do
All
we
right.
know that the great-great-great-grandfather is buried next to the wife?
Yes,
Yes, that we do know.
and their daughter Lydia is
And
there
their daughter
also.
Lydia is there
And
as
she
well.
has a headstone as well. But
Yeah, she's got her own headstone.
he hasn't got one.
No, but we do know that.
So this is Thomas Brooks, who was born in Newbury, Connecticut, where he enlisted in the company of Captain Elizur Warner of the 7th Connecticut Regiment in April of 1777. He got a serious case of smallpox shortly after enlisting. It was very serious because there was a shortage of doctors, medical supplies, and sanitary conditions. Luckily, he recovered and was able to continue on. He served 6 years as a private. He was discharged at West Point June 9th, 1783, and his discharge papers were signed by George Washington. He married Esther Beers, and in 1805 they moved to Penfield. Well, it wasn't Penfield at the time yet, but he moved to this town. They were part of the organizing body of the Congregational Church in 1806, which later became the Presbyterian Church. Thomas served as a deacon and then later as an elder. Thomas was a farmer, and the couple had 11 children. He later suffered from a kidney ailment, and then he died in May of 1835, age 71. Esther died in May of 1839, 74 years old. This is a new granite headstone that was placed by the Penfield Rotary and the Monroe County Veterans Service Agency to honor the bicentennial of the country. The DAR ladies researched. They found 9 Revolutionary War soldiers, and they really researched each one of them, and we have write-ups about each of them. I think there's at least one other one that I've come across, and maybe 2 more. I can't get anybody to recognize them, though, so if anyone has any connections with DAR or SAR, send them our way, and we'll see if we can get something done for the other people that haven't been recognized.
So we're moving now into World War I. This is Leland Erkfitz. There's about 90 Penfield men enlisted in World War I. 2 women from Penfield served as nurses in World War I. And of all those, 30 of them are buried in Oakwood. Leland was born in September 1893. He was a PHS graduate in 1910 from the high school, and in April 1917, he enlisted in the 74th Infantry at the age of 24. He enlisted in April. He was sent to basic training in Buffalo, and in June 1917, he died of septic poison caused by an abscessed tonsil. So 6 weeks after enlisting, he didn't even get out of New York State. And again, I would use this as a moment to think about the wonders of modern medicine. I have a daughter who's had an abscessed tonsil 3 times, been in the hospital several times for it, and she's done better than he did. But yeah, I feel for Leland not getting out of New York State. His commanding officer, Captain Charles Sandbury, wrote to his parents after Leland died, said Leland was a soldier of sterling worth, faithful and honorable. He gave unstintingly his friendship to those with whom he was associated. His great number of friends is a testimonial to his exceptional character, which after knowing him for 6 weeks is not bad. I think that's a pretty good reference. One of the sort of Penfield side to this, the 108th Infantry, which he joined, owned the rifle range, which is down on Empire Boulevard. You can go there and have a wander around. And the building on the left-hand side is the officer's house, which is quite nice. But I know from personal experience that if you go there to that shooting range, there's all sorts of bullets still there on the ground that you can pick up and bring home with you if you are so inclined. I'm not sure you're supposed to, but you can.
We won't tell.
No, don't tell. All right, this is you.
Okay. So these, just you have to take my word for it. The headstones of the Stroger family. John Stroger came to operate Daniel Penfield's sawmill in Grissville in November of 1800, years before the Penfield family came to town. He died September 8th, 1812 at the age of 45, and the reason we almost always speak about him is because he's the one that has the oldest marked grave in Oakwood Cemetery. Also, one of these graves belongs to his son Samuel, who was 3 years old when the family moved here. So he saw, that would have been in 1800, he saw the town as it was growing. And later he wrote articles for Little Nellie's paper on the early pioneers of town. So you see, everybody's connected. It's great to know that. Everyone works together and is connected together.
And Nellie wrote about all of them.
I'm sorry, what?
And Nellie wrote about all of them.
Yes. And then this is just an interesting story about the family. Also, who's buried here is Samuel's daughter, Margaret. She remained unmarried until she was into her 30s. Then she married a widower, William Worthing, who needed to be remarried because he had 5 young children. His first wife had died. And so they married in 1854. In the 1855 census, they're living together with his 5 children. The couple had a daughter together, but by 1860, Margaret and her daughter are living back at her father's house. Margaret's listed as a widower, and William is living with his 5 older children, and he's also listed as being widowed. So I don't know if they both wish that the other one had died, but yeah. So, and the area at Whalen and 5 Mile Line was referred to as Stroger Corners in the early days because that stucco house on the southeast corner was one of John's sons, William. He lived in that house. And then on the northwest corner, the big building that's still standing there, the William and Samuel operated a cider press. And then who's not buried here in that family is Almond Stroger. He's buried in St. Petersburg, Florida. But he's probably the most famous. He invented the automatic switch for the dial telephone, which was used in telephony for 100 years. Most all of the 20th century, it would have been his switch. He wanted to get rid of the operators because he was running a funeral parlor in Kansas, and a friend of his died, and he didn't get called to do the funeral, and he realized that the operator was the girlfriend or the wife of one of his competitors, and that guy got the job, so he decided he was going to eliminate these, they called them hello girls. He was going to eliminate them, and he did. So you can find all kinds of information on him. It's just he's not really buried here in Penfield, but we claim him because he was born here.
We had some Stroger families along Lake Road in Webster, and I think they were a part of this family.
Yes, there was, Charles was one of Almond's brothers. And another interesting story about them, they lived on Whalen Road. There's a big white house there shortly before you come to 5 Mile Line. I don't know the number. That's the property where they were born and grew up, but it was a small cabin that they lived in, which was later moved to the back of the property and then was taken down. But there were a number of children in that family, and the boys were always trying to invent things. Their mother said they spend more time trying to invent a machine to do a job than the job would have taken. One thing they experimented with was a flying machine, which they were trying off the roof of the house. And they didn't get credit with building an airplane, but they also lived to go on and try inventing other things. But the one you're talking about, Charles, he married, I can't remember the name, but they lived up at 9 Mile Point.
Yeah.
It was that family. And then their other sister Hannah lived up there. There's a church along Lake Road
Yeah.
that they were responsible for starting. So the Strogers had a big part in the history of the area.
Somebody at the Webster Museum, they have one of the Stroger's diaries.
Mm-hmm.
There are 2 or 3 you might someday like to read.
We would like to read them. And there was another brother, John, who went out west and he wrote letters back about the herds of buffalo that he saw and all the different things. It's what an exciting time to be alive.
I understand that AT&T still gives out an award called the Stroger Award.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. And he is he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame a number of years ago. So it's a big deal. But we don't have him buried here. No. He was one that retired to Florida and was buried down there. Yeah. And this young man is Aristides Francis Church, nicknamed Tide. And he's another one of my favorite characters. He was the son of William and Emmeline Kennedy Church, born December 12, 1846. He lived his entire life around the Four Corners. Where he grew up is the house that's just west of the St. Joseph Cemetery. I think there's an insurance office in there now. You have to go up over the hill to get to it. That was where he was born and grew up. And then later, when he married, he built a house on Liberty Street. He kept diaries that spanned 1864 to 1933. So it's a lot of years. And we have most of them, not all of them. But he recorded things like the weather, events around the Four Corners, his earnings and expenditures, and he recorded some vital records. And if you picked up one of the diaries and sat down and started to read it, you would probably fall asleep. Because they're not that interesting if you're just reading them, but they have so many facts in them. They're great resources to learn about Penfield at that time. And so one of our volunteers for the History Room, who isn't present tonight, he and his wife went to Florida for a number of years. We made copies of these diaries, and he'd take a couple with him each winter and index them. So he's got people's names, events, places. So if you're looking for something in a particular year that happened around the Four Corners, you might be able to find it readily because it's been indexed in the diary. So Tide's main occupation was painting buildings and signs and wallpapering. He worked on the old town hall building, which is on South 5 Mile Line Road. It's
Art studio now. Or an
art
There's an
studio,
Yeah,
or
there's an art studio there.
and he describes that in his diary. Unfortunately, there were 2 fires that occurred on the southeast quadrant of the Four Corners. 1878, I think, was the first one, and 1899 was the second one, and they pretty much wiped out the buildings there. Those are 2 diaries that we don't have. I don't know if someone kept them on purpose because they wanted that information themselves, but it would be great to find out what he had to say about these fires. But he was also kind of writing for the future. He was writing kind of like a historian. And in 1896, he contacted all of the Civil War soldiers from Penfield that he could possibly find through relatives, because many of them didn't come back here to settle. And he found out about what they were doing at the time and how their lives had changed, and he compiled all of this information in a book. So we have an after record from 1896 of the Penfield Civil War soldiers, and it tells us a lot about their lives and what they did. And then in 1919, he was appointed the first town historian in Penfield. That was the year the state decided that every municipality should have a government-appointed historian, and he became the first. And he did the same thing with the World War I soldiers that he'd done with the Civil War soldiers. So we also have a record of what became of them after the war. Tide died in November of 1937, age 90, and his wife Alpha had died in 1927. Also in the same lot, on different headstone a little farther down, is his older brother Pharcellus, and it's such a sad story. Pharcellus was with a group. They had these young boys who were training for war before the Civil War ever started. They proclaimed themselves to be a young Zouave unit, and the Zouaves wore these fancy uniforms that they kind of looked like something that you would see in ancient Persia or something, you know. But these boys all they were doing was parading around town and things. Well, Pharcellus enlisted in the 108th Infantry when he was old enough, as soon as the war had started. It wasn't long until he contracted one of the diseases that many of the boys did and died from it. His body was brought back to Penfield, and he was buried from the Baptist church on his 18th birthday. So with those Zouave uniforms, it was the 140th, the local unit, that was a Zouave unit. And they actually had some of those uniforms later, which weren't really a very wise choice because red.
Good targets.
They had red cummerbunds and big wide pants and making yourself a really good target. Yeah. So that's it for Child Church.
You're on a roll, aren't you?
Oh, yeah. So this man, he looks very serious, but again, I think he just had to sit perfectly still for the picture. But he was a very hardy man. He was born April 5th, 1786 in Massachusetts. Two of his married sisters had moved to Northfield, which is what the town was. This whole area, all of the towns east of the Genesee were part of Northfield. His two married sisters had settled in the area that became Pittsford. And so he decided in 1799 that he wanted to visit them. Well, there were no trains or buses. He must not have had a horse, so he walked from Massachusetts to visit his sisters here. He was 14. I hope his parents hooked him up with some other people that were traveling and didn't let him go off alone. But he would have had to sleep under the stars and hunt for his food because there were no McDonald's or Hotel Sixes along the way. But what's even more amazing in some ways to me, he saw the power of Irondequoit Creek and he decided at age 14 that he wanted to purchase some land there. I wonder how many 14-year-olds today are looking at purchasing land. So with his father's help, he purchased land, which eventually numbered 1,000 acres. And that was right around the Penfield and Parrington border, 5 Mile Line Road-ish. So he came back walking, purchased the land and stayed. In 1809, he married Mary Case, who was the daughter of the Baptist minister, Reverend Joseph Case. Shortly after he arrived here, he built a sawmill near the head of the falls, just over the Penfield-Parrington line. I can tell you why in a few minutes that it was just over the line. In 1816, he built his house at 2204 5 Mile Line Road.
We don't have a photo of that.
Yes, we do.
Do we?
The next one.
Really? Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, we do. Sorry.
Which is still standing today, and it's one of our town landmarks. It's a beautiful house. So let's see, he built that in 1816. He was in partnership with Andrew Lincoln, and he built a grist mill in 1821. And he also operated a brickyard in the Thomas Creek area for a number of years. Some of the brick buildings that are around the four corners that are still standing today, one of our previous historians speculates that the bricks came from his brickyard. So his wife Mary died in 1842, and within 3 years, he'd sold his interest in the mill and his house, and he moved downstream, which really kind of seems like it's upstream because it's going north, but it is downstream. He built a sawmill at that location to cut wood for his flour and grist mill, which he built in 1848. It still stands today, and it's the only remaining mill in Penfield, and that's the Daisy Flour Mill. He later sold this and moved to Rochester, where he had something to do with the mills that were around High Falls. And he was living in Rochester when he died, July 11th, 1875. So he was one of the movers and shakers in the early town.
All right. I'm going to let Kathy give her voice a break for a minute.
Okay.
So we're finishing up with Daniel and Mary Penfield. I think those of you who've seen the write-ups we did about this, I promise you the founding fathers and mothers of Penfield. And Mary Penfield, for sure, was one of those. Her family lived in Sheffield, Massachusetts. She grew up about 25 miles away, west of where Daniel Penfield's family came from. She was Mary Fellows before she was Mary Penfield. They had 5 children. She followed Daniel wherever he went, basically. She was his wife. She didn't have that much of a choice. They lived for a good long while in New York City. And then in around 1811, he said to her, "We need to go west. We need to go to where my land is, to Penfield." And she was not thrilled with that idea. This is a woman who was used to living in the highest of the United States young society at that point in New York City. She wasn't thrilled, but he promised her that he would build her a house that was as good as the ones that they were leaving behind. What's interesting about Mary Penfield is and Kathy just told me we have some of these documents. Her name is on several of the documents from the time that they moved to Penfield. She was signing things in her own name, which was unusual for a woman of the time. She was in a wheelchair by the time they came to Penfield. We don't know,
We
right?
don't know.
We
for
don't
sure
know.
when she. We don't know why she was in the wheelchair.
We don't know why she was in a wheelchair, but she had a servant whose name was Black Zack. We assume that Black Zack, had been one of the Penfield slaves, because we do know that Daniel Penfield owned slaves when he was living in New York City. But they are not listed. New York State ended slavery in the 1828. But the 1820 census that we have them in, they're not listed as owning slaves at that point. But anyway, so that's Mary Penfield. The one other thing about her sister Charlotte married Horace Bush, also in Penfield, and they lived in the Bush Fellows house, which is on the corner of Wayland and 5 Mile Line.
The Duck
The
House.
Duck House. If you all know the Duck House, that was the Bush Fellows house. And again, we don't know for certain, but the Bush, it's likely that that's the same Bush family as the Timothy Bush family, which does make Daniel Penfield somewhat related. If we're really looking for links, it does make him somewhat related to the Bush presidential family as well.
But even if he isn't related, he was a very good businessman.
He was.
And he was something. So he was born April 25th, 1759 in Guilford, Connecticut. He served in the Revolution as a commissary clerk under Oliver Phelps. And you might know that name because Oliver Phelps and Nathaniel Gorham purchased a large tract of land in this part of New York. And so you can imagine the commissary group, I mean, they were still sleeping out under the stars and things, but they weren't the ones that were shooting and being shot at. They were delivering goods and food and whatever else the soldiers needed. So they probably weren't quite as tired as the fighting soldiers. So you can imagine they sat around the fire at night and talked about when the Americans drove those British out and won the American Revolution, that the lands would open up in the West and they'd be available to purchase, and how you could make money buying these lands. And so he planted that idea in Daniel Penfield's brain. He married Mary Fellows in 1784. She was the daughter of General John Fellows, who was an aide-de-camp to George Washington. And at that time, he opened a general store in Hillsdale, New York, on the Hudson River, and that store was burned by the mob in Shays' Rebellion, which was a rebellion. The farmers and less well-to-do people were just angry at the merchants, and the more well-to-do, and they were on a tirade. And so Daniel Penfield was one that lost his store. He then moved to New York City, became a successful merchant. As Anna was telling you, their family had a 3-story brick house in New York City, and it was across from it was across the street from the Battery. It was on Water Street, which is right around the corner from where now Wall Street is. So Daniel belonged to this Tontine Association, which is actually the group that started Wall Street, and another one of the members of that, whose name you might recognize, is Alexander Hamilton. And one of his neighbors was Duncan Fife. So he was like moving in circles with the movers and shakers. In 1790, he began purchasing lands in western New York. First, he bought land in Wayne County, and he bought some land in Parrington. But then he saw the value of the falls of Irondequoit Creek. In 1 mile, it drops 90 feet, and that was just right to power the early mills. And Daniel knew that. And so that's when he began buying up land in Penfield. And by 1800, he had clear title to the entire town, which included Webster at the time. So it's a pretty big town. The family moved here about 1810. After he promised to build them a house as spacious and gracious as the one that he was leaving. And his house is still standing today. Do we have that picture? 1784 Penfield Road, there's a salon in there, Salon Enza. But the house at the time the Penfields lived there was 2 stories bigger. There was a story to the east and a story to the west that were removed. The one to the west was moved down to the corner of Liberty Street and became a freestanding house. And the one to the east was moved across the street and became part of the Humphrey House. So it's still a pretty big house, even without those 2. And so he had formal gardens to the east of the house. And they say that he had a pet deer that would eat out of his hand in the gardens. And then beyond the gardens was his store. He was running a general store. He had a sawmill and a grist mill. And he also owned the water rights. This is why Samuel Rich and Andrew Lincoln built their mill just over the Parrington town line, because Daniel controlled the water rights and who could build and who could operate something there. It might have been a good idea, it might have been a bad idea, but that's what he did anyway. One of our early residents, Calvin Owen, said he was like a dog in a manger. Like, he didn't want to use all the water rights, but he didn't want anybody else to use it either. So like a dog in a manger wouldn't want the animals to be eating the hay, but the dog wouldn't really want to eat the hay. Let's see. One thing he did that was really good that kept Penfield growing was to allow the cash poor farmers to make their mortgage payments with grain. They'd bring the wheat to him. He would actually take it and trade for part of their mortgage payments, and then he could either turn it into flour or whiskey. And there was a great market in Canada for both of them. So then he could float it up Irondequoit Creek into the bay and across the lake, and then there were markets in Canada. Daniel Penfield died August 24th, 1840, at the age of 81. And so we always put them at the end of our cemetery walk. I don't know, maybe we should put them at the beginning the next time, but it seems like a good way to end. So unless anybody has questions, we are finished.
I would say a couple of things before, thank you. We just put a couple of websites up here. If you are interested, if you're ever in Oakfield and you want, Oakwood, and you want to know more, if you Google Oakwood Cemetery, they have a great website. And there's a resources tab there on the homepage. And if you click on that, it'll do a drop-down menu, and they have online, you can find anybody who was buried in there. If you know their name, you don't need to know when, but you can find them there. We use that a lot. It's on I have it saved as a bookmark on my thing. There's also findagrave.com if you're interested in that. And then just finally, if you want to get people's stories, Ancestry.com wants a paid subscription from you unless you come to the library. And if you've got a library card, you can use it on any of the library computers for free.
And before we end, I just want to get back on my soapbox and tell you again about the pictures. If you have photographs and you know who's in them and you know the date, mark it down. And the others, and I have another soapbox to get on, and that one is write your memories.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I'm starting another memoir writing class through recreation in January. That's how we hooked up with Tom and found out about Jacob Eckler. We didn't know that we had someone buried here who had been captured by the Indians. Everybody's story is important. You might think I just led this ho-hum life, but your stories are important, and you can help to honor people that you want remembered. So you can join my writing class, or you can set aside a time every day and just write a little bit. You don't have to sit down and write your autobiography in one sitting, you know. Just write a story about your favorite aunt or your grandmother or your grandfather or something. And people that come after you, your children or your nieces and nephews, will be happy you did. And then if you have a great story like Tom's story, share it with the town wherever it took place in, and they'll be happy to have it.
Just to build on your comment about writing, identifying photos, if you're writing on the back of the photo, don't use a ballpoint pen.
That's right. Use a marker.
A marker or a
Sharpie.
pencil.
Well, a pencil sometimes makes a line that comes through, so actually a permanent marker is the best thing. Or put it on a piece of paper that
Stick it
you,
on.
yeah.
Or a
that-
gel pen.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
I just wanted to say, you know, at the 5 Mile line, the four corners there, you have the park now with Daniel Penfield, and he's holding the millstone.
And wearing a Bills jersey.
I was driving my grandson past there one time when he was little, and he said, "Grandma, what is that man doing with that big bagel?" So I smile every time I look.
Yeah, think about that.
He's holding his very much.
That's funny.
Yeah.
So I've been here 30 years, and I've probably walked through the cemetery 10,000 times with a dog or friends or whatever. So I see all these Wayland, Harris, Jackson. Those were all people that roads were named for all around here, and I guess they were farmers? Or?
Yes. You see, it would start out, the name, it would be like the road to the Harris farm.
Right.
Or it would be their lane. Nobody else would have lived along there. And so then people just started calling it the Harris Road or whatever. And it stuck. It seems so simple, but that's how they started out.
My favorite one of those is the Scribners. So the Scribners had a farm up there, and they were one of the very, very earliest people to come into Penfield. They had a log cabin up there, and we've got some oral histories from a few generations on, and they keep talking about the pipe smoking grannies. And then there are a couple of very elderly women, relatives of the Scribners who lived in there, and one of them talks about how when she was there, and this would be the sort of 18 teens, she saw more Native Americans than she saw white people, is what she was saying at that point. So it really was the frontier out here, which makes that house that Daniel built his wife.
Right. But she still had to be pushed around in her wheelchair
Yeah.
with probably wooden wheels on unpaved
Yeah.
ground. So she was
Very
brave.
grease on the bearings, yeah.
Yeah. Anything else?
3 quick ones.
Sure.
You might answer my question. I live off Fellows Road, so that's
Mm-hmm.
one of the
Fellows.
fellows. Number 2, is there any, like during this Spanish influenza, was there any, like a lot of burials, like 1918, 1920 for that?
Actually, we had a researcher who was writing a book on the flu epidemic in the area, and she came in and used Tide Church's diaries because he had a diary from that year. He doesn't mention it at all. So I think maybe because Penfield remained agricultural until after World War II, I think it was pretty isolated. And so perhaps not many people caught the flu, or Tide Church just didn't know about him. I don't know, but we don't really have any record of a lot of deaths from that.
And number 3, you showed a picture, was it Covey said that?
Covey?
Covey?
Covey.
There's like a big pineapple on top of the gravestone, kind of like a pineapple shape. I wonder what it's
Pineapples are a sign of welcome. I don't know if you're welcome.
Well, they're kind of well.
I don't know.
Like a pineapple on top of, I don't know what that meant.
Yeah.
Was it a cross or anything? It's kind of,
Yeah,
if it meant anything.
I don't know.
It probably does.
Cemetery art was is a whole field unto itself.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot about it online, actually. If you Google, pineapple on top of a
Yeah.
gravestone, you might.
Looks like a
get-
pineapple.
Yeah.
Or just cemetery art. Victorian cemetery art is
Right.
probably what it would be under.
Yeah. If you actually, if you go around, some of these gravestones were sort of pre-produced, they were mass-produced to an extent. And you can see similar toppings. They use the same symbols and carvings, and then you would just get the name stamped on it. Yeah. So, yeah. Yes.
No, I'm not taking
I
your
don't
question.
know. Really?
You don't have a picture of it, but you might also say if this was the live cemetery tour
Yes.
about the non-stone gravestone.
The white
Oh,
zinc.
the white zinc ones?
Yes, if you're walking through the
Yeah.
cemetery, I think there's 7 or 8 of them over there. They're made of, it's called white zinc, and they're actually metal. They were cast, and they have kind of a greenish, whitish tint. Once you recognize them, you can see them, any cemetery you're in, you can see them from a distance. And they were made Civil War to about 1920. I'm not certain why they fell out of favor. I don't know if they were cheap, people thought they wouldn't hold up, or if they were expensive and nobody could afford them. But they really did, they don't rub off like
They don't.
stone. They
You can still read
Too
them.
many put on that, zinc is toxic. So they may have stopped casting them because when you heat zinc, it gives off toxic.
everybody that was making them died. So there was no one else to make them.
If you weld the galvanized metal, you
It
can
does
poison
nasty things
yourself.
to your lungs.
Yeah, oh, that's,
it's really nasty.
it seems like though around 1920, they wouldn't have quite been
Well,
looking at
that, you
that.
said that was the end of it.
Yeah,
About the
right.
time when they started to figure out.
To figure out that's what's going
Yeah,
on.
that
Well, it's
could
a shame
be.
because they last really well.
Yeah, they do. And if you wonder if it's really metal or stone, if you knock on it, they're hollow, so you can
I
tell.
think they were cheaper because zinc was relatively available
Yeah.
and you didn't have to have a stone carver involved.
But you would have had to have the thing set up, the mold set up for that particular person with the,
Yeah, but
with the
you
word.
use interchangeable letters. just
Yeah,
like a print
that's true,
press.
that's true.
Sand and whatever.
So anyway, when you're walking over there, take a look for them, because they're
I think
kind
they
of,
have a bunch of them in Mount Hope too.
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah.
And they talk about them.
I'm just also going to give a shout out to, some of you may have heard about this already, but Penfield now has a new Wall of Heroes down by the rec center area where they are honoring current Penfield residents who are serving in the military. So if you're here and you have a couple of minutes, it's well worth just going down there and seeing. It's beautiful. They've done a really good job with it. So,
Thank you.
all right. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. There are some old
That was
cemeteries.
wonderful.
Thank you.